Today on the Catholic Mass series, we ask the big question: where do we go from here? After nearly 50 episodes on the liturgy, Father Palko helps us to take stock of what we've learned about the traditional Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass, and the confusion in the Church that underlies this crisis. What reforms are acceptable? At what point must changes in the liturgy be rejected? Can the liturgy develop without compromising the faith? And what does fidelity look like in an age of confusion? As we approach the end of this series, we look ahead with realism, charity, and hope, knowing that true renewal must begin with holy priests, holy families, and unwavering love for the faith. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. So now let's join Father Palko for episode 48 of the Catholic Mass series, Reform, Resistance, or Renewal, the Road Ahead for Catholics. Father Palko, it is good to have you back on this second to last episode of the Catholic Mass series.
We're nearing the end.
We're nearing the end, and thanks for bringing us pretty close to home. Today we're talking about kind of starting our wrap up, and we started the wrap up a little bit already with Father Robinson talking about authority and liturgy and how to make sense of that. But this week, Father, we're talking about briefly the antidote. How do we fix this? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, and I think that was sort of the question that I presented as the topic, the topic for this. I remember in the organizational notes we called the antidote. I think it works well to say, where do we go from here? Well, maybe let's see where we're at to start with. Right, we're in a bit of a crisis. We had a whole series of podcasts on the crisis in the Church. We've now talked about the Mass amongst trying to give a sort of a didactic and catechetical, instruction on the Mass throughout. We've talked a little bit about the crisis of liturgy that we're in, or some will term it the liturgical wars. So we're in that. And as a result of that, one of the last podcasts that I was on for this series, we talked about the 1962 liturgy. And I think that's where we're at. We're often accused of sort of wanting to freeze everything in 1962. And in a certain sense, that's true. And in a certain sense, that's false. And the antidote's going to be kind of turn around that a little bit. Those who have gone on the Ignatian retreat will know that St. Ignatius talks about the discernment of spirits. Right? Oh, yeah. And amongst a variety of the different rules there about how the devil's a woman and various other things, and tries to whisper in her ear and, and then cry when, et cetera. No, he talks, the first couple of things he talks about are in discernment of spirits. When you're in desolation, which is a kind of crisis, a crisis of one's spirit, you don't make any change. The inspirations may be there to try to draw you some way, but you don't change. It's the worst time to change because you're not evaluating things well. Even though I think there has been some scientific disproving of this, it's also why you don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry, because you buy a lot of things, and if you're really hungry and you go to get some food, you buy far too much. Because you're trying to satisfy an immediate need. You're not looking at the long-term problem here. So in this crisis, we shouldn't make any drastic changes. It's when we're in consolation, when we are sort of in normalcy, that's when we should make some changes. That's when we should maybe consider prudent change at that point. So liturgical revolution that we've seen here, the liturgical situation we're in that led to the Novus Ordo Mass, was a massive crisis, and we're in this crisis. So being in crisis, the last thing we want to do right now is start making little changes, especially to the position that we're in. Now, once we have some semblance of normalcy in the Church again, which is, I guess, sort of where we're trying to get to and why we're talking about this way, then we can consider the developments, the reforms that seem reasonable. And it is that there is a reasonable amount of reform. Even Archbishop Lefebvre, as I hope we'll get to, wanted some reasonable amount of reform back in the 1960s. He objected already during the Second Vatican Council where it seemed to be heading, but he saw that there was some need of some reforms. Even St. Pius X, as we've seen, despite the fact that he is, anti-modernist, there were some changes, especially the breviary under him. It's not as if we object to this whole living tradition idea in the modernist sense. Of course we do. But the church has changed things in the liturgy over the years. She's changed her way of presenting the faith. And that's what we discussed, if you remember back in episode 45, I think it was, on the 1962 Missal.
Yeah.
And I think Father Robinson has addressed some of those points with regard to the authority in the church and the authority that the church has to modify the liturgy, as Pius XII assures us that the church has.
Yeah, that makes sense. So reforms are allowed, but I think the point that's missing is I think folks say, well, you can change the church can change the liturgy anytime. True. The church shouldn't ever change the liturgy because it should hold on to traditions. It's false, but you get the idea behind it. But in the middle ground is this idea of prudence. And we've talked about this with the calendar. We've talked about this with vestments. We've talked about this with architecture and art, like all the ancillary things. And it holds true with the actual words and everything about the liturgy itself. You don't just go in and just start changing things and messing things around.
Right. And that's part of what led to the problem. But it's also sometimes what you'll see, even traditionalists, even well-meaning people try to suggest. So we need to go back to this. It was the whole difficulty with some of the pre-1955 Holy Week. Good as that may be, and as I admitted a preference for that myself, if we start sui juris changing things or doing what we want, or in this area, in this church, in this society, in this place, and we're going to have just the same amount of chaos. We only then get to claim tradition. That's, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas of tradition. The church, though, and her idea of tradition is that things can change without the substance of the faith changing. She obviously has changed her manner of communicating the faith. The faith doesn't change. The manner of communication changes. Right? But when it goes quickly, we have a problem. The bark of Peter is a very large lumbering ship. Right?
Yeah.
It's full in the sails and in the gussets. And when you try to turn such a large ship on a dime, you break things. And that's what the 1960s changes did. It was such a quick thing, and it was committee organized and not the very long, slow period of change that allows for that prudence that broke things. It's not the turning that's the issue. It's the turning imprudently. It's the turning towards things that perhaps the church shouldn't turn towards that got us into the problem. And that's where we need really a long-term view, and changes need to be generational. And that's also, I think, a point about how this crisis overall is going to end. If we think that we can have just one person, one pope, one savior, and a person themselves to fix everything, and it's just, we snap our fingers, it's all done, we're back in 1950 again, we're going to be back in the same problem again.
That's a really interesting point. I have been thinking this for a while. Maybe this is a tangent. Let's say we had a very good traditional pope. Maybe Pope Leo XIV will be that pope. We don't know. And do you think it would be a mistake for him to just say, new mass, abrogated, traditional mass, done, like next Sunday, done? I think that would be an error, honestly.
I think on a prudential level, we're fighting two different things. Obviously, we would say the Novus Ordo presents a danger to the faith, so we need to remedy that.
Right.
If there's not something in place to take that place, there's going to be a vacuum.
Yeah.
And are you going to get more rebellion throughout the church? That's also a question of prudence, and that's the virtue of the leader. And obviously, you're going to have to sort of break some things,
right?
When you make any changes,
yeah.
Right? Things get broken, But how do you do so in such a way that you don't destroy the faith of millions of people in doing that?
Right.
Goodwill people who don't know any better. And part of the problem here too is also it's a problem of catechesis. One of the reasons we got into this problem is catechesis. One of the ways we'll get out is catechesis, helping people to understand where the problem lies, And as I hope we'll see in discussing this today, it's not a problem primarily of liturgy, it's a problem of doctrine.
Right.
And the liturgy is a reflection of that.
Right.
And the thing is it is, all of these things, even the faith, even the explanation of the faith, are accommodated to the men of the time in which we're explaining it, right? We have the Baltimore Catechism. That hasn't always existed, right? It exists now because it's questions and answers, and we can read it. Not everybody could always read.
Right.
And so there were other ways, long sermons, hours-long sermons that none of us could sit through these days.
Right.
The panegyrics of the French, of the French nobility and the priests and things like that. That if you read them, clearly took hours and hours to go on. We goldfish are giving us a challenge these days in our attention span.
Yeah.
So that's obviously not accommodated to us. But we do need to accommodate various other things. It's not though in a Hegelian dialectic, right? We're not looking to compromise theologically, certainly, in the approaches that we take here, and we can't. But there has to be this understanding of what compromise really looks like and what it doesn't look like. Liturgy, just like the faith is accommodated to men, it's going to change. It has changed. It will continue to change. And even if we sort of freeze now, it's a matter of prudence. We take the last acceptable right, but not because this represents some perfect embodiment of everything
Right.
we've discussed.
Right.
But we can't, in the long term, think that that's going to be the fix. 1962, 1954, 1910, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
We can't just pick one point, and that's the point, and everything else has to go right back to that. It's going to be starting from a solid basis, which last acceptable one, 1962, seems the most logical place to start. And then it's going to say, okay, well, we're going to perhaps make some modifications to Holy Week. Maybe we'll restore certain things. Maybe we'll eliminate certain things. But that's going to happen over time.
Yeah.
It's an authentic reform that we're going to get that starts with principles and not just this, as we've seen, sort of a failure in this idea of an Hegelian dialectic in that reform of the reform that was, big in 2007 or so and seems to have been completely forgotten.
Yeah.
And I think even by good-willed people who are in the traditionalist community outside of even society circles, you're starting to see an admission that was a bit of a pipe dream, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think if we say that we need to stay in this one moment in time, again, whether it's 54 or 62, whatever, we risk becoming like the old Catholics who were, stuck at the First Vatican Council. They split off from the church in that way. We could end up becoming like that. And I think we have to be very careful that we're holding to the liturgy of this day and time because it's the last one, not because it's the magic one that is the perfect one. I 100% agree.
Right. And if you do look at it, the other thing to say about that, too, is we have in the 1962 liturgy, we have substantially the same thing as 1570,
yep.
as more or less the Middle Ages.
Yep.
Yes, there are changes, but it's substantially the same. Whereas in the Novus Ordo Mass, which we can't accept, we don't see a substantially similar thing. We see a materially similar thing on certain levels, but not formally or substantially the same. And that's why I would say any authentic reform that we're going to go to, any antidote in the end, has to be backed up by what is theologically acceptable, and then move forward from there. So we obviously can't, like I said, accept the Novus Ordo. We can't start there. We have to start with something that doesn't embody those principles and those false ideas that come into it. Because remember, as we say in the society, it more or less, and there are certain more, certain less, the nature of the Novus Ordo Missae undermines the nature of the Mass, the nature of the priesthood as an ordained priesthood, and he tries to muddle in this idea of the common priesthood of the faithful, and it undermines the real presence. And so we can't start from a poisoned start. Yes, in its more unicorn-like forms, it may be better and be less of a danger to the faith, but remember what's happening when you see those more unicorn-like forms, the more perfect Novus Ordos. They're just aping the traditional Mass.
Yeah.
They're looking to be more like that.
Yeah.
They're taking as a model something that they wish they could be, but they can't. And let's be honest, no one in reality who likes that kind of thing really wants the Novus Ordo in Latin ad orientem. It's just sometimes the closest they can have to the traditional Mass in those cases.
Right.
No one prefers the Latin version of the offertory over the. They may want the English, they may want the new Mass, but they don't want this. They don't want this unicorn.
Right.
That's just the best that sometimes people can get to. And let's be honest as well, the majority of Catholics aren't coming from a point where that's the norm for them. It's not as if we're competing between the most perfect Novus Ordo you could ever imagine, like the traditional Mass and the traditional Mass. We're not doing that. It's something entirely different. And since we can accept the rites in 1962, theologically, they're based off of good principles. That's why we stopped there. Not, again, because it's some pinnacle of perfection. And that's also why I think it's probably a non-starter to have lots of arguments. Discussions are fine, but lots of arguments. We need to go back to 54. We need to do this thing. We need to do that thing. Let's replace this. Let's pick one front at a time for this battle. It doesn't really go well when you open up multiple fronts in a land war in Asia.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Nice reference. So. And that's the point, is that I think we did I don't remember if it was the Sacrament series or the Crisis series or Questions with Father series. I don't remember, but I remember doing an episode with Father McFarland, and it said, and the title of the episode was, "It's not just about the pretty Mass. We're not just here because the Mass is pretty, because we have a vested interest in it even, or because we prefer it. It's because there's a theological reason. Let's talk about that theological reason. To talk about just restoring the traditional Latin Mass is, forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, a bit of a smokescreen."
Yeah, and indeed it is. Because again, the crisis that we're in is not merely liturgical. The liturgical part of the crisis is a symptom of something bigger, something that's far bigger than liturgical. And let's be honest, the crisis we're in, the modernist or neo-modernist crisis, the modernists and neo-modernists were saying the traditional Mass.
Right.
It's a crisis of the faith.
Right.
And the Mass is a reflection of that. And you can see that. It's obvious. I mean, we've seen things more recently that show us that indeed those people who want to destroy the faith come after the Mass because it's an expression of that.
Right.
They don't come after the Novus Ordo. You know this. They don't come after the unicorn Novus Ordo. They come after the traditional Mass. That it's a very clear bulwark there.
I was just Sorry, I was just going to say, I was just watching. I'm about halfway through an interview with Matt Fradd, Pints with Aquinas, and Peter Kwasniewski about about the Latin Mass, and it's funny. They make this point. Hey, Hollywood movies don't use "On Wings of Angels" when there's an exorcism scene. They use Gregorian. Sorry, I'm stumbling all over. They use Gregorian chant. They use Latin. They use the old. Why? Right? Even Hollywood knows that there's a difference.
Look at the Godfather movies. Like baptisms in Latin and various other things, etc. So, I mean, they see that there's some solemnity. They see that there's something. There's even an art to it, as it were, a beauty to it,
a dignity. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and yet at the same point in time, we're not wanting to get stuck in 1962 as a fixture, right? Even Archbishop Lefebvre was not against certain liturgical changes that are mentioned or at least encouraged by Sacrosanctum Concilium during the Second Vatican Council. Yeah. He writes about this in 1965. It's in the book A Bishop Speaks. He says, in view of the speed rare in the Church with which these changes have been carried out in all countries, it is difficult to avoid the fear that some measures may bring unforeseen and unhappy consequences. It is thus with devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, devotion to the Virgin Mary and the saints, whose statues have been banished from many churches, regardless of the simplest pastoral teaching and catechesis, the meet and proper ordering of the house of God, which has become a house of men rather than a house of God, the true divine beauty of the Latin chants, which are now banned, have not been replaced by other such melodies. So he's lamenting these things, but he writes immediately afterward, must we, however, conclude from these considerations that all of these things should have been kept unchanged? The council, with temperance and prudence, has answered otherwise. Some reform and renewal was needed.
Yeah.
That's Archbishop Lefebvre in 1965. Now, remember, in 1965, he's battling the modernists over doctrine and various other things. He's trying to get the Nota Previa into Dignitatis Humanae. He's trying to make sure that, the worst of the worst won't happen with the whole group of the fathers that he has there, the council fathers, the conservative ones. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't see in the liturgical side of things, he doesn't see absolutely nothing that doesn't need some reform and renewal.
Right.
One thing he wished to incorporate, in fact, was more vernacular, especially into the early part of the Mass of the catechumens, for the Epistle and Gospel, for instance. Mm-hmm. Maybe always to have the vernacular, even whether it's chanted after or not. There's different ways of doing that, but he saw that as one of the important things that could be done to help people to enter more into the liturgy. Whether that's good or bad is up for debate. But the very fact that he, championing during the time of the modernist crisis and the neo-modernists and the new theology, all of these things he's fighting, he doesn't associate something like vernacular in the Mass necessarily with that.
Right.
And even suggests that might be a good thing.
Right.
And ultimately, that's up for debate. But the idea that no changes are acceptable at all, that's certainly not. The liturgy has changed. Saintly popes have changed it well before the modernist crisis.
Yeah. It is interesting. I think many traditional Catholics, many who attend SSPX chapels in particular, who have a great respect for Archbishop Lefebvre, might be surprised to hear what you just said, that he was championing some changes and he identified, or at least was okay with the notion of some changes being made to the Mass. Again, he didn't see it as the static thing that had to remain. What are some other things? Do you have other examples of things that he would have been okay with, or things that would have been acceptable to explore or look into?
Well, he doesn't speak too much about any of them, but he did, remember, at the very beginning, and this is before a lot of this sort of the fight over sedevacantism and the Old Holy Week and various other things came into vogue early in the society. There were times early along where they were using at Icon the sort of experimental 1965, 1967, some of those changes there. Yeah, there's still traditional Mass, but remember during that time there were local variations. The vernacular was allowed at certain times, etc. One example of this, one of the early Masses you see in the old chapel at Icon is you see the subdeacon incensing the Blessed Sacrament at the elevation. Mm-hmm. Normally during a solemn Mass, he has the humeral veil over, but that was done away with in the 1965 changes, for instance. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, little things like that might be able to be done. Is there a symbolism we're losing, or is there something useful there? It is interesting, too. In the 1962 and before Requiem Mass, the subdeacon doesn't carry a humeral veil anyway. So It's not as if this is a novel change, and maybe it's a good thing. I mean, the manipole was gotten rid of, but maybe that's a useful thing. I don't think it is, but I think there's a symbolism. We don't remove fence posts, remember, Chesterton tells us that. Right. But it's there are other things like that he certainly he doesn't speak about a whole lot of them, because I think he's just trying to reassure people at the time. Yes, there are some changes. Yes, they're revolutionary in certain places, but it isn't as if there aren't some things that need to be happening. It's just the speed and the revolutionariness with which these things are being done that's really problematic. And you see that. That's what he was complaining about there. He doesn't speak too much, as far as I'm aware, of any other changes at that point in time, because, again, he was focusing more on doctrine. But the very fact he was willing to have some more vernacular, it seems like there were probably some other things that he would be willing to at least tolerate or accept.
Okay. What about other bishops?
So even there, remember, the council doesn't come out of nowhere. There were preparatory things. Archbishop Lefebvre was on one of the preparatory commissions. He was on the doctrinal preparatory commission. And before the preparatory commission, they had an anti-preparatory commission. So it's the preparatory commission to the preparatory commission. Right.
Assistant to the regional manager.
Yeah, exactly. So to 1959, they're sending out requests to the bishops. Okay, Vatican II was coming up. what do you want to discuss? What topics should we address? And this is an opportunity for the bishops to give some input. What's interesting there, too, is if you survey some of the responses that they send back on liturgical changes, there's only about, from a study that I saw, about 7% who see any opposition to any liturgical changes whatsoever. Most of the bishops say just absolutely nothing about it. It's about 52% just don't mention the liturgy at all.
Okay.
And then 41% mention being open to some liturgical change. So it's not a majority of bishops, but it is a significant number that seem to be open to some liturgical change. And yet, even there, only about 29% want any structural changes to the Mass whatsoever. Most of the complaints are about the participation of the faithful and how to increase the participation of the faithful, both by attending more Masses, receiving communion more regularly. So one of the requests that comes in, or at least a few bishops mention it, to reduce the time for the Eucharistic fast to maybe an hour from Mass. So on a weekday, you could come and you could, during your lunch break or something like that, you would have these opportunities more often to come to Mass, and maybe you would participate more.
Yeah.
And maybe the Eucharistic fast could be shortened for that, which ended up happening, as we see. Maybe that's a bad idea. Maybe it's a good idea. But these are some of the ideas that were there. Some of the bishops talked about restoring the universal prayers, the prayers so-called of the faithful. We still have on Good Friday at the offertory, that orphaned oremus there, where we don't actually say a prayer afterward from that. Adding prefaces for certain occasions back into, some of the Gallican prefaces that were added, even some of the newer ones that were more recently added in 2021 or 19, I believe. So those are obviously not major changes that the bishops are requesting. Right? One of the things they ask about is more vernacular in the Mass, the catechumens, or like the baptismal rites and various other things. And especially they start asking about simplifying the pontifical rites. In 1959, a bishop has 3 options for saying Mass. He can say a pontifical low Mass, which requires 2 chaplains and 2 servers. He can say a pontifical solemn Mass at his faldstool, which requires basically a solemn Mass plus an assistant priest, and then at least a couple of capellani who are carrying around some of his things. Or he can do the Mass at the throne, which now requires 2 more ministers plus a few other people. He doesn't have the option of saying a low Mass like a priest, or a sung Mass, or a solemn Mass. He just can't do that. And then the rites themselves that the bishop will celebrate oftentimes are very involved. So the bishop himself can't just rock up to the parish and start saying a Mass for everybody, or he can attend the Mass, but this doesn't allow the bishops to be quite as involved with the local clergy. So changing some of these things, even the papal rites, there was talk about let's just simplify these a little bit. And papal Masses were relatively rare because they required so many ministers and functions. There was communion at the throne, for instance. Yeah. You can imagine how complex and that would be. A fistula, a little straw from which the Pope wouldn't actually touch the chalice. He would just... So all of these things, very interesting in themselves, but that's also why, changes a little aside here, you're not going to see the Pope doing a solemn Mass anytime soon.
Yeah. Because
that would be an innovation. That would be a change. So should the Pope do that? Would that be a great sign? Well, maybe, or maybe it actually is a perturbation to this whole process too. In any case, the point being with discussing some of these things, you look at it and almost no bishop who came to Vatican II wanted the Novus Ordo or anything like it.
Right.
When they were presented with that normative Mass in 1967 at the Synod, even the Cardinal Secretary of State, against the Pope, is coming out and saying, we need to just stop these changes. This has gone far too far. We just got to stop. And when it was put to a vote, only 38% of the bishops showed any interest in it. A lot of them reservations or absolute, horror at what had happened. Cardinal Heenan in England just absolutely horrified at what he saw, and also called for a variety of different changes, etc. So, so obviously the Novus Ordo isn't a good starter for this. But some of those liturgical principles are okay. And that's where we have to sift through these things. But it's really the church that has to sift through those. And that's, again, why the antidote isn't to start making changes. But we do have to realize that some changes wouldn't necessarily be bad, but just have to be done prudently. So moving forward, we start from a position of security, the 1962 right, the traditional rights, and then we can look in not a time of crisis at what can be done from there.
Yeah.
And look at the liturgical movement itself. It started on good footing, right? Dom Guéranger and many of the others in the early liturgical movement had good points to make. And they were trying to encourage this real liturgical spirit amongst the faithful. And that's really what if there is an antidote out there, where do we go from here? It's going to be trying to develop that real liturgical spirit amongst the faithful again, those who are maybe coming into society, but also those outside as well, and encouraging them to embrace the real liturgical spirit that should be there, to appreciate the Mass for what it is, to demand the traditional Mass, etc.
I'm thinking of several different analogies, like when you're trying to bake something or cook something and you try to add different things in, and the recipe ends up kind of like, oh, things are sticking, things are burning. Maybe you need to stop, pause. Okay, you've done too much, put it aside, start over. Start with the Betty Crocker cookbook, that recipe that you know is good. And then you can change a couple little things. Are there principles at play where we could do something similar to that? So let's say we went back to the 1962 and let's say we said, hey, there are changes that could be made. What sort of changes? What are the principles at play where we could start making changes? We as the church as a whole, not just individuals.
Yeah, I think we could. So I guess it's going to depend on who you ask where we start on that thing. Archbishop Lefebvre starts in again, A Bishop Speaks, in some of those letters early during the council. He starts speaking about what a real liturgical renewal looks like. So he has some, I guess you could call them principles, just sort of guidelines that we should remember. So he says first that the liturgy has a human character to it. And as a result of that, what is said and done has to be able to be understood. It may not be understood, and it may take some effort on the part of the faithful to do so. And that's the engagement and the participation and the study and the reading of the texts, et cetera, that the faithful should be doing themselves. But it still should be able to be understood. Not lowest common denominator. Be careful that he doesn't say that. He says capable of being understood. Right. It means when we put in the effort, when we work at it, we can begin to appreciate at least certain aspects of it.
It shouldn't be this hidden secret thing, not like Gnostic ways of doing it.
Right. It's not Gnostic. At the same point in time, it is meant to speak to us. I mean, in the modern sense of that, it's meant to draw us somewhere. And that's why, in fact, a liturgical language that's universal for preserving unity is absolutely important, at least in the sacramental parts, in the Mass of the faithful, for instance. There is a point to that, and in blessings, in exorcisms, but there is a point to having some vernacular, say, in the rite of baptism or in other things there. When you get to the sacramental formulas, perhaps Latin only, he's suggesting. So it has a human character. On a second thing that we can think about here is he says it has a divine character. And that's essentially that the liturgy enters into the mystery of the very life of the Holy Trinity. Remember what the liturgy is. It is the prayer of the Son to the Father. It's the offering of himself again, a renewing that sacrifice that he made on the cross. Even if it's achieved through his mystical body, it's still entering into this very life of the Holy Trinity. And because it's a mystery, the symbolism and the ceremony are not always going to be immediately evident or able to be understood that way. And they shouldn't be completely understood on a human level, but we have to be able to give room for contemplation to continually draw more and more from these things. But everything that's done in the liturgy, he says, has to be firstly ordered towards God. It may draw people towards God, but it has to be ordered towards God and not towards men. And that reason being is his third point, that the purpose of the liturgy is union with God, right? The liturgy on earth is an image of the eternal liturgy. Again, we're not having Mass in heaven, right? But the idea of this communion with God, beginning in this communion together in worshiping God here on earth. And so we have to understand the text. That's important, but it's not the primary focus of the liturgy. And there has to be this effort to educate the faithful and help them to rise up to understand the liturgy, because one has to know before he can love. So if one's going to love God, one's going to love who God is, he has to know what God is. And he learns a lot about that through not only the doctrine, but also the liturgy. So that's Archbishop Lefebvre and his principles. I don't think Dom Guéranger was much different. He explains that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Father Hanos, I believe, who was in episode 12, so a long time ago, talks about Dom Guéranger and the liturgical movement. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Father Hanos. But
it was. Yep.
Could be wrong on that. Okay. And in there, he talks about some of Dom Guéranger's principles, how the liturgy is first and foremost an act of worship. It's saying more or less the same thing as Archbishop Lefebvre, but put in a different way. And so because it's first and foremost an act of worship, we do still, what is said needs to be understood, but that's not the first idea. The faithful have to be able to engage and participate because it's an act of worship, and they have to be able to begin to worship. But at the same point in time, he says the liturgy has to reflect the progress of tradition. The primitive liturgies developed as the church developed and the society developed. And then they reached their pinnacle really in around the Middle Ages, the age of Christendom. And while reform might be needed, one of the things that Dom Guéranger was already saying back in the mid 1800s is we can't idolize the primitive. We can't just go back to these very primitive sources, which aren't probably explaining all of the details of things, because it's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to be a scientific study of these. We shouldn't idolize those things when there's a relative perfection of the liturgy that we have with us, and that understanding, we see that participation and understanding really hits a peak in the Middle Ages. So that really should be our model, is what he says. Tradition progressed, and it gained various things, and it spoke to the faithful to reach a kind of pinnacle, again, relative, but again, just as we don't idolize that part, we don't idolize 1962 either. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that these are reflective of each other. We don't just go, okay, well, let's just simplify everything. Let's go back to, how the apostles said Mass, and let's just do that. Hey, no, there was development for a reason.
Hey, there's documents that talk about the early Christians receiving communion in the hand. Let's go back to that. Wait, right. What's the reason why? And we've talked about that in detail, but what's the reason why?
Indeed. Yeah. And then you find out it wasn't exactly what you thought it was.
Right.
A lot of this ressourcement has happened with the liturgical movement, with the various biblical sourcing and things like that. We find out that maybe people weren't 100% honest with those sources, or maybe those sources don't actually show what they're claimed to have shown.
Maybe stop relying so much on origin for the basis for everything.
Right. But even there, he's probably better than finding some obscure second century text that seems to be from Hippolytus, but maybe actually isn't.
Exactly.
Etc. So, and then he finally says, Dom Guéranger, that liturgy, because it's universal, needs a universal sacred language. If he says, when it speaks in the church, like he speaks in the marketplace, well, the church is going to turn into the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. Something like, vernacular isn't, there may be some room for it, but to just have only vernacular lowers something there. And we have to be careful about that. So those are his principles. If we line them up with Archbishop Lefebvre's principles, and I'm sure others could come up with them. Basically, the idea is that the key here, the antidote, is a return to a true liturgical spirit and a solid doctrine about what the Mass, what the liturgy is. It has to be experienced really as a transcendent reality. It is something that exceeds here and now. And it has to be engaged as real prayer, a real propitiatory sacrifice in which we are getting to participate, not some man-centered thing. And if you look at it, that's one of the key differences between the traditional Mass and the Novus Ordo. One is focusing on everybody understanding and participating in a very human way. Even the priest facing everybody is meant to sort of include everybody together, but as some gathered body without this hierarchy there. Now, the turning of the priest, I mean, even in St. Peter's, the Pope, when the papal altar would face the people, but that's facing east anyway.
Yeah.
And you would not see him because of all the various things on the altar that were blocking your view. But that's an entirely different question.
Yeah.
Be that as it may. Without that true liturgical spirit and transcendence, without a supernatural perspective about these things, any reform, any changes are just going to get us back to the Novus Ordo, a human-focused theater, basically. They're just going to focus us back on ourselves if we don't look up. And whatever changes are going to come in are going to have to engage and involve men, so they draw the men upward. So this is that transcendent reality there. It's the fundamental flaw that flowed from the Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo. It's why it sort of got stuck in 1970. It's why it has that feel to it. It's that paternalistic and patronizing attitude versus what is elevating. Right? In order to speak to everybody, it speaks down to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing is, though, that wasn't a new spirit. You can see that as a spirit of the age, even in some of the changes, even in 1962, that could be objected to. For instance, the renewal of baptismal promises, right? It's a great concept. In fact, there are incidents where it seems like that might have been done. It's clearly, though, a rite that's designed to focus on the faithful rather than on some transcendent reality. And so it feels a little out of place. And it can sound like a 1965 era teacher lecturing a 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
There is a place for these things, but again, we have to be drawn upward. And these are the kinds of changes that maybe, while they're safe, we can start to see that maybe they're not as transcendent. But then again, remember, we talked about, and Father Robinson talked about the very few number of prayers that survived.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem ends up being, too, is you can see the spirit in how the translations of the Novus Ordo are made. You can see this anti-transcendent reality. The traditional Latin Mass, a few Sundays back, 2 months about now, on the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, has as the collect prayer this beautiful prayer, Omnipotens sempritene Deus, qui badans sia pietatis tui meritus supplicium excidis et vota, etc., which literally would translate, O Almighty and eternal God, who in the abundance of thy loving kindness are wont to give beyond the deserts and desires of those who humbly pray, pour down upon us thy mercy, forgiving us those things of which our conscience is afraid, and granting to us those blessings which we dare not presume to ask. Right? A beautiful thing, asking for, we're afraid to even mention these things of our own sins. Still forgive us, despite the fact of our fear. Mm-hmm. And despite the fact that we need blessings and we don't even know what they are, and we're not even, we shouldn't even be asking about them because they're so silly for somebody so sinful to even ask for. Please give us those things too. A beautiful recognition of God's dominion, his supremacy, and also his mercy for us. Now, how does the Novus Ordo translate that? Now, the newer version is a little bit better.
Okay.
But what did we hear throughout the 1970s? What was the spirit of the age? Not, O Almighty and eternal God, who in the abundance of thy loving kindness are wont to give beyond the deserts and the desires of those who humbly pray. But, Father, your love for us surpasses all our hopes and desires. Forgive our failings, keep us in your peace, and lead us in the way of salvation. Again, it sounds like we're talking to 5-year-olds. It's not transcendent. The Mass, the liturgy, needs to be this transcendent reality. It will draw us up. And ultimately, that will prevent a lot of the humanistic things that come out of there. This supernatural versus natural confusion is perhaps the most important problem plaguing the church and society today. This confusion between what is above, what is supernatural, what is noble and profound versus what is just vulgar and common. We have this problem even in our own societies, in our families. We don't look at a hierarchy in the families. So it's on all different levels, but especially in the liturgy. But the liturgy, if done right, is a tool to remedy that if we allow it to do so. Yeah. And that, I would say, is also going back to what we talked about with participation, why authentic participation in the Mass is so important. The silent spectator problem that bishops were complaining about, that is sort of the hobby horse of so many of us, is that liturgy just becomes something priestly. It is, and it primarily is, of course. But it also, and more fundamentally, is the worship of the church overall as the mystical body. Remember that entrance into the life of the Holy Trinity. And that's to say, there are a variety of ways to participate, again, going back to what we talked about back in that episode, even silent ones. But if we come to Mass without that transcendent spirit, just to distract ourselves from Mass and use that time for personal devotions, for instance, we're also part of the problem. We have this anti-liturgical spirit. We're going to get the Novus Ordo again when we try to make some reformations, if there could be. We have to treat the Mass as the august sacrifice that demands our attention and our devotion.
Yeah. The we've mentioned this before, that the crisis in the church is not liturgical. It's not just about the Mass. I mentioned that towards the beginning of this episode. It's doctrinal. There are bigger things at play than just the Mass at play. So how should we, as the SSPX, as traditional Catholics, how should we be approaching this, and what can we do?
Well, so it definitely is. And I think that is probably the biggest difference between the society and various other groups.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are probably good priests out there in other groups, et cetera, that have this perspective. So I'm not trying to lambast everybody, but the society understands and does what it does because of the Mass itself, but really behind that, the faith, right? If the Mass hadn't changed, the society probably would be doing the same thing, but the Mass had to change because the doctrine changed, the ideas changed, the errors that come from the council demand that kind of thing. But remember what Archbishop Lefebvre was pushing during the Second Vatican Council. They wanted to be a pastoral council, but okay, that's fine. Let's issue pastoral documents, but let's back them up with doctrinal documents. Here's the doctrinal stuff, and here's what we tell the people about it. Here's how we explain it. And he saw that when that approach was purely pastoral, there was great imprecision, these time bombs, as we speak about at Vatican II, and there's lots of latitude that gets given. But when the pastoral was just a means of simplifying and distilling dogmatically sound texts, the ambiguity gets resolved and in reference to that doctrine. And so a pastoral question, the liturgy, also gets solved by doctrine. The liturgy will change to reflect the doctrine, right? It's how we believe as we pray as we believe, for instance. The law of prayer influences the law of belief. So if we work on this liturgical pastoral question, and that's all we focus on without realizing that the fundamental problem is doctrinal, the new theology, we're on a fool's errand.
Yeah.
It's why we have some of the somewhat more controversial stances that perhaps some people would think we have, like, ask a society priest, hey, could I go to this traditional Latin Mass in the diocese? I'm not going to be near a society chapel. What should I do? And we might answer the question, I mean, okay, I'm not going to recommend that. Mm-hmm. Wait, you're not going to recommend that I go to a traditional Latin Mass? No, I'm not saying it's sinful to go. I'm not saying it's invalid. It might be important to help your soul, but I can't recommend it because I don't know what's going on there. I'm very happy that priest is saying the traditional Latin Mass. Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the things that we encourage. I've trained Novus Ordo priests to be able to say the traditional Mass. We want to spread this around. But it's a question of the faith. Most diocesan priests, even some of the other societies that say the traditional Mass, Latin Mass exclusively, have zero theological problem with the Novus Ordo. They're starting from this compromised position that says it's not a question of doctrine at all. It's a question of liturgy only. Yeah. And so, again, we're on a fool's errand if we start from that position. They may not prefer the Novus Ordo, or they may have a special charism to not say the Novus Ordo, but it's not a matter of doctrine for them. And that, again, that's not going to be an antidote. That's not going to lead us down the right path. That we're hitting the wall in this maze if we go down that path. We may be closer to the end. We may be able to look over the wall and see it's over there, but we're actually further away that way if we're not addressing the real problem that's there. Or maybe there are those that get trapped in some practical matter keeps them from actually taking a stand. That's quite sad when you see a priest who wants to solve this problem, wants to say the traditional Mass, but there's something holding him back, and it's very just a practical issue. It's an issue of his health care or something like that he can't lose from the diocese.
Yeah.
you can't really blame these good priests otherwise, because many of them don't understand the problem because they didn't get a good formation.
Yeah.
They didn't have a solid theological formation or philosophical training. And so they don't understand that Novus Ordo is as dangerous as it is. But we do have to, understanding it ourselves, and as we've talked about the problems and the difficulties and the dangers, realize that beyond just the Mass, we don't know what a priest at a place like this is going to say. You know, is he going to preach and instruct the faithful about good things? Probably.
Yeah.
But I can't guarantee that.
Probably. But
I can't guarantee that what you're going to receive is, not consecrated at a clown mass. Right? I have no idea. It's the traditional Latin Mass it's a sign of orthodoxy. It is in and of itself a bulwark, but it isn't a guarantee in and of itself of orthodoxy, because again, every modernist before 1969 was saying the traditional Latin Mass.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it's today perhaps a much more clear sign of things, but it's not a guarantee. Mm-hmm. But remember what we as a society were looking to try to sort of this antidote we were looking to try to inject into the church for many years now. That was as a precondition to us having any doctrinal talks, which were the key doctrinal talks. Remember, docs solved the doctrinal problem. One of the first preconditions is what turned out to be Summorum Pontificum. Mm-hmm. Right? We want freedom for any priest anywhere to say the traditional Mass. Because when you put these things up against each other, the traditional Mass wins.
Yeah.
So that's part of the antidote, is more freedom for the Mass. But again, we can't forget the doctrinal side. So we didn't, when we then engaged in doctrinal discussions, which unfortunately didn't lead anywhere, but they led to a point where even Benedict XVI realized or understood this is an issue of doctrine.
Yes.
Right?
There's a recent interview by his secretary where he actually speaks about exactly that. It's on the news website. You can look it up. It's funny because he talks about that. Yeah, we did Summorum Pontificum. This is what they asked for. All right, now let's move on to the talks. Oh, they're doctrinal. Okay, we got an impasse, and by that point he had resigned. And you won't say it, Father, but I will, since I'm not a member of the SSPX. I can say to those people who are like, well, the freedom for the traditional Latin Mass and Summorum Pontificum would have happened without the SSPX, would have happened without the quote-unquote disobedience of Archbishop Lefebvre. We look from history and we can say, no, Summorum Pontificum happened because the SSPX petitioned it. Guys, you're welcome. Like, I know you won't be that snarky because you're very kind. I will be. You're welcome. This is. I
can be snarky at times, but I won't be that snarky.
Yeah.
But no, Benedict XVI recognized that in 2009, when the so-called excommunications of our bishops the juridical effect was removed. Mm-hmm. Read that as you will. I see in that an admission of nullity, but read that as you will. We still lack canonical status, according to Benedict XVI, because of doctrinal reasons, right? The errors of Vatican II play into this whole mess. It's primarily doctrinal, because even those things we discussed in the Crisis series end up denigrating the supernatural dimension of the church and the faith. And so, of course, the Mass has to reflect that. Or it's going to remind us of the problem that there in our theology. The new theology, the Nouvelle Theologie, from which the errors flow, is a humanistic, man-centered Pelagian theology. Mm-hmm. And so the Mass it produces is humanistic, man-centered, and Pelagian. Mm-hmm. I mean Pelagian here by dismissive original sin and confusing grace and nature together. Those prayers that were, hacked apart, and the various epistles and gospels and things like that remove mention of sin in the new Mass. Why are those there if not for this Pelagian spirit that we can save ourselves? Original sin's not that bad. Sin itself isn't that bad. You can receive grace simply by being a good person, an anonymous Christian, for instance. And that was the whole doctrinal basis for a lot of what John Paul II says, is that Christ uniting himself to man somehow sort of saves man. It transforms, saves human nature without us doing much anything. So I think it's really important to focus in any antidote discussion, or where do we go from here? It has to be not just the liturgical side, it has to be a doctrinal side. They play off each other, and they both have to happen more or less in concert with each other, or we're not moving anywhere.
Right.
We're only moving backwards at that point in time. If we're not moving forward, we're in this crisis which is sweeping us over the waterfall behind us. If we're not swimming against that spirit, if we're not trying to do better catechesis, educate ourselves on these important topics, both liturgically and doctrinally, and come to the real faith that is there, the traditional faith, we're going to be pushed over the waterfall one of these days ourselves.
Yeah. I think in this discussion, it is important to discuss the history of the change of the Mass, even if it's done briefly. We've talked about it. We've had a couple episodes where we talk on this in some detail, but I know some people are going to be watching just this episode for the conclusion. So let's touch on it sort of briefly. Quo primum, though, so devil's advocate, quo primum, right? The document by Pope St. Pius V says, no one can change this Mass under penalty of or incur the wrath of St. Peter's and Paul. Doesn't that mean that the Mass shouldn't ever change and that liturgy shouldn't ever change at all?
No. Right. Simple answer, no. What that did was centralize the development of the liturgy in order to combat Protestantism. It didn't end organic development. It reduced the effect of it, and any changes that were made had to now go through the Holy See. But the very fact of changes happening after that point in time by the next pope afterward, the next pope after him, in very small little ways shows that certain changes could be made, but they had to come from the Holy See itself. And as I mentioned there, Pius XII, when he's talking about Sacramentum Ordinis, I believe it is, Sacramentum Ordinis, talking about the holy orders and solving the question of what's the form and what's the matter for these questions, mentions that the Church has freedom to change these things that she's received from Christ. So it's not as if one pope can bind the other pope.
Right.
And no pope can bind his successor. They're of equal weight, unless it's something on doctrine, obviously, that once you define something, you can't then go back and undefine it because it's not actually yours, it's part of the faith, but different question there. But what effectively the Council of Trent and Pope St. Pius V wanted was to say, okay, you've had enough time to develop these rites. We're going to pick this rite, and any new development is going to be focused on this one here, and you're going to ask us about it before you do anything along these lines.
Which is not a bad strategy at all.
Yeah, and that's also why the Sacred Congregation of Rites was created, to answer these kinds of questions as these things came up. What do we do here? What do we do there? Can we do this? This is our tradition. What do we do, etc. Example, recently we had the first anniversary of the consecration of St. Vincent's, the church here. Beautiful ceremony, long. If you want some beautiful music and everything like that, go to the seminary's website and look for that. It's beautifully done. But a year later, one of the things that we've done in celebrating that is during the solemn mass, the deacon would go out and incense the places on the wall where the chrism was marked by the bishop the year before. It's not instructed in the rubrics that way, but it's something that is a Greek custom that was borrowed in certain places. And so looking at the Sacred Congregation of Rites, can we do this? Certainly seems like we can. They gave permission there. So it's a laudable tradition. It's sort of, the more eastern side of the Slovak side of my family sort of gets a little chill on those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Like, ooh, this is kind of nice. It's like incensing icons. I'm a Latin, not a Byzantine, but still kind of rubs me the right way on those things.
It's extra liturgical. It's not contra liturgical, right?
Yeah, it's in or it's not even extra. Sacred Congregation Rite says it's actually in accordance with the rubrics. It's praeter legem, but it certainly doesn't violate anything, and they accepted that it can be done. So it can be done.
Great.
So in any case, the quo primum is, and the effect that it has on this way forward is that really any real change is going to have to come from the top. It's going to have to come from the Holy See, at least by way of permission, right? So even if we have these two rites competing against each other in a summarum pontificum way and a fair fight, that's not influenced by certain other documents that sort of take things down. If you put them on the same level, it's still the Holy See that has to start giving those permissions and various other things. It has to come from the top. The liturgy isn't our own. We've talked about that a number of times. We don't have the power to change it. But what we can do is demand that we have the traditional rite and refuse the new. It's an effective strategy. It's been an effective strategy. You sort of mentioned that before, right? 1970, new Mass comes out. Exceptions to use the older rite are only for priests who are of so-called advanced years or illness. I mean, I'm not that old, but I'll claim that if that works for me. And then the 1967 modifications were obligatory in that case, and you could only do that for private masses. So there's lots of restrictions. And then we had people who were demanding the traditional rite, the so-called Agatha Christie indult from England. Okay, Paul VI says you can use the old rite in England and Wales. That's in 1971. Now, a few years pass. In 1984, the same permission, because people are demanding it, is extended universally. A litmus test, the Novus Ordo has to be accepted as valid and doctrinally sound. But the 1984 indult, as it were, allows much more worldwide permission in these things. 1986, the Pope calls together a commission of cardinals, including Cardinal Ratzinger, who later reports on this, that they did Missale Romanum of Paul VI abrogate the traditional rite. Can no priest say it? Or can every priest say it? Is quo primum still in effect? He confirmed that was the case in 2007. Right? So in 1986, the Commission of Cardinals is answering this question. I mean, that's the demand for this thing got cardinals to answer this question, the Pope to call together these men. In 1988, certain things happened. But one of the things that happened was the Pope removes a lot more of the restrictions and called for a wide and generous application of that 1984 indult. And then finally, what do we get in 2007? We get Pope Benedict allowing that 1986 judgment that he and others had made to basically allow the freedom of the traditional Mass, at least privately, right? And even Cardinal Castrion, the head of the Ecclesiae Dei in 2008, said he had spoken to Benedict, and Benedict's idea was that this would allow every parish to have the Novus Ordo and traditional Latin Mass side by side on a Sunday.
Oh, wow.
And then they could have a fair fight, basically.
Huh.
And so it was this continual demand for the traditional Mass that led to all of the permissions. And I think it's quite a success, of course, too, to see the need for the draconian whiplash that was Traditionis Custodes, right? Yeah. You don't need that unless we're making inroads, unless it's succeeding, unless the Mass of all times is actually succeeding. So we're going to try to crush it. It's not going to work. We know that. But the Mass, the traditional Mass, was winning. It was slowly winning over people, especially the younger crowd. The old guard was dying off, and their 1970s liturgy with it. Right? Yeah. And those unicorn masses that people were asking for, desiring, they still wanted something more transcendent, even if they couldn't have the traditional Mass. It's this continual demand for these things that was really making this thing. That's an effective strategy. And if part of the antidote is going to be keeping up that effective strategy and not trying to think that we can have this reform of the reform.
Yeah. I think I'm looking at your notes here. You have this bold statement, but I think a fair one, where you say the liturgical changes at Vatican II and after are not Catholic. What do you mean by that? Well,
like that. Okay. They're not Catholic.
All right.
They're sourced in, yeah. Well, they're sourced in a drive to, not a drive to communicate the Catholic faith and the idea of the Mass better, but they have ecumenical overtones, very clearly so. I mean, the whole rite, remember, it was Protestant ministers who were involved in making sure that this rite was not displeasing, right? Archbishop Bonini said very clearly that he wanted to remove a stumbling block to the Protestants. Mm-hmm. So he wanted it possibly so that even the Protestants could use this liturgy. It was supposed to be such a milquetoast and anodyne, thing that you could do anything with it. It wasn't specifically Catholic. We've said that before, right? That the Novus Ordo isn't a Catholic rite. It can be modified into that. It can be made almost anything, right? But that was the intention behind it. So we can't think, again, the perfection of a change is the reform of the reform because of those ecumenical overtones, those anti-liturgical principles that are there, that desire to reduce the Catholic elements that are in the Mass, especially in those ways. We mentioned the three ways that the Novus Ordo really attacks the traditional understanding of the faith. The only way to stay inoculated from those ecumenical overtones, from the errors that flow from Vatican II, are not to accept the reform of the reform. It's a compromised position. And that's perhaps maybe a little uncomfortable for some people who really thought that Benedict XVI was, the pinnacle, the reforming pope who was going to restore tradition. his approach from his earliest days up to his papacy were always Hegelian in their nature. This idea of you have two separate things, and we're just trying to kind of compromise between them. And so there you go. You have Benedict XVI, who presents this idea of the traditional Mass. You have this. On the other hand, you have the traditional Mass and the Novus Ordo, and they're meant to kind of compete against each other. They're not just two ends of a spectrum. These things may seem like they are, but they're not just two ends of a spectrum where some happy middle ground can be had. They are specifically different. This reform of the reform is too idealistic. It's doomed to fail. And we saw with Traditionis Custodes, it did. It really did fail.
Mm-hmm. And it was about ready to fail more. But again, the thumb was put on the scale there.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And who speaks of that now? Who wants to have this sort of reform of the reform anymore?
Right.
But again, that unicorn Mass isn't a solution, right? A Latin language or Ad Orientem Novus Ordo Mass with chant only and male servers is still the Novus Ordo. It still contains the same theological problems that we've complained about. If that exists, and it's a big if, whether that exists in more than maybe one place that we've found a video for, maybe St. John Cancius in some place, and we put it online. So we say, this could be it.
Yeah.
It's less of a danger of the faith than other places, sure, but it's still a danger of the faith. And Cardinal Ottaviani, and he's very clear about that, and he wasn't commenting on the average vernacular parish Mass he saw. He saw the normative Mass. He saw the ideal that Archbishop Bonini was putting out there. He didn't see the unicorn Mass. He did see the unicorn Mass. He didn't see the average. The solution to our crisis, the antidote, is not just better than milk toast or not as poisonous.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's got to be better than that. Yeah, absolutely.
It's got to be better than that. It has to be, again, that transcendent reality.
What are some, as we kind of wrap this up, what are some practical considerations? What are things that you and I can do? Because, among a billion plus Catholics, we're going to be, still minorities in a lot of ways. But what are some things that you and I can do to kind of help move this, advance this idea of proper reform, of proper an antidote?
Well, I think it's a hopeful vision that the traditional Catholics have always been a very small minority. Will continue to be, but we always were. And look at the effect we've had. So already we can see that it doesn't take a worldwide movement of millions of people. I think the apostles should show us that too, by the way. So there's something that happens when God's grace is behind you and you're on the side of God and not on the side of destruction. But we should create a positive feedback loop, right? The more the Catholics will boycott, and I'll put quotes around that, but the more that Catholics will refuse or boycott the Novus Ordo and insist on the traditional liturgy, the more quickly we're going to find a solution. To be very practical about it. If we allow ourselves to continue to compromise on this, well, I can't get there, it's too far away, and et cetera. If we're not going to insist on the traditional liturgy, we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to move anywhere. So the more Catholics who go to the traditional Mass and not to the Novus Ordo, the more graces for the Church by a deeper love of the liturgy of the Church, the more solid catechesis, the quicker we're on a practical level, we're going to find a solution, not just on the level of grace. And the more that we try to just fix the Novus Ordo, the longer we pretend there's no fundamental problem, there's no crisis, right? And we're just aping the traditional Mass throughout that whole thing. It's a fool's errand, as I've spoken about. So positive feedback loop. Demand the traditional Mass, refuse the Novus Ordo, continue to do that, and we'll start to see real change. We'll start to see this demand creep up. We'll also start to perhaps hit the pocketbooks of various bishops who will want to have that money back, and we'll maybe start some more places for the traditional Mass.
I didn't see that. I didn't see that in your notes. I was going to bring it up. Maybe I was going to be too tacky, but you're absolutely right. I mean, money talks.
Yeah. Well, it's a good indication too that I'm not just stuck to my notes on these various things. We actually do have a real conversation, even if sometimes when the notes are published or whatever, there are certain points that we say word for word. We do have a real conversation back and forth on these things too. So, so I think it's a good, hopeful, practical point too, that the experiment of tradition that Archbishop Lefebvre spoke of was winning. It is winning.
Yeah.
The exclusive insistence on the traditional Latin Mass has produced more and more permissions, even up through 2021. It wasn't until then that we had this effort to kind of clamp down on things. And the very fact that that clamp down shows that it was working. The fact that restrictions were placed ostensibly because of that growth also caused people to start questioning whether there's something else going on there. The errors of Vatican II perhaps maybe are there because the enemies see that tradition is winning against these things and always wins when the match is even-handed.
Yeah.
It's the idea of this experiment or experience of tradition that Archbishop Lefebvre spoke about. The only thing that he was really asking, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, when he would speak to those in Rome, he would say, let these let the experiment of tradition prove that this works. Mm-hmm. And it does. Yeah. And as we said, on a practical consideration, while Rome has to fix the problem, we still need a grassroots movement to move them that direction. Rome's not going to move without a groundswell demanding a restoration of tradition, right? And that's going to require sacrifices from everybody. But hey, that's the Catholic life, right? A good Catholic life is a life of sacrifice because it's a life that's reflective of our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself up. It's a reflection of the liturgy in that way too. Sacrifices on the part of the faithful. So yeah, you may not have a traditional Latin Mass in your town, and maybe not in the next town, maybe not in the next city. But don't use the pitiful excuse of, well, it's 3 hours away, and really so it's just too far. I mean, okay, if you can't afford it, everything like that, fine. But maybe some sacrifices should be made to go to authentically traditional places, not just better than what I have locally. People were doing this for a long time. It's what built the traditional movement. It is what continues to build the traditional movement. And where you can, don't just go to Sunday Mass when you have access to just Sunday Mass. If you want a real liturgical spirit, if you want the graces for yourself, your own spiritual life, your salvation, but also for the church to help get ourselves out of this mire, we've got to make ourselves holy. We've got to go to that cross every day. And the more that we can do that without disturbing our duty of state, the more graces we'll have. And that may require, again, more sacrifices to make that happen. To ask for perhaps an extra hour off from your job or work an hour late so you can come to Mass in the morning. Maybe that's a good thing. Or maybe you can't come to Mass, but you can make it to confession on that weekend or benediction that evening.
Right.
Those kinds of things will help create that liturgical transcendent spirit that is going to then encourage us to do even more. Maybe for some families, the solution is going to have to be to move to a place near a priory or a church where the traditional Latin Mass is. And maybe that's going to cost some income or inconvenience for work or lifestyle. Maybe we won't be able to have everything. Maybe we will be living a little more hand to mouth. But in doing that, we'll also have our Lord handing out himself to our mouth and the graces that flow from that from the traditional Mass more often, and schools to help support our children and various other things that will help them be formed doctrinally well so they can then pass on this tradition. It's the whole idea of tradition, in fact. And of course, encouraging and supporting traditional vocations in the church. Spiritual works, yes, volunteering, teaching, but even financially, help support these vocations, help support these churches too. It requires also on the part not just of the faithful, but on the part of priests to take a stand, maybe to risk their own comfort, their diocesan salary, their insurance, their support, maybe even their friends. We have great examples of that early in the traditionalist movement. Do we have that now? I mean, we've had very heroic priests who have come over to the society, who have embraced the traditional Mass, but early along we had priests like Father Yves Normandin, right? He started with the Novus Ordo. He saw there was a problem there. He rejects this innovative spirit, but he meets Archbishop Lefebvre. He understands the problem, and he goes back, and he's not going to say the Novus Ordo anymore. His bishop tries to expel him from his parish in Quebec, but the laws didn't allow that eviction. He had a constant perpetual adoration going on, and they weren't allowed to come in while a religious ceremony was going on, so they couldn't come in. So they summoned him before a local tribunal as a witness, so he would have to leave the rectory. And then they changed all the locks on him and wouldn't even give him his own things. So what did he do with the rest of his life? He's traveled all over Canada. And what did he find? The faithful supported him. So if any priest who wants to embrace the spirit is afraid, as long as he's not going to do weird or bizarre things, is not going to, there's not a reason that he was canceled, for instance, aside from his traditionalism.
Right.
If he wants to embrace this, the faithful will support this. They crave this kind of thing. And it's not rebellious to want to basically embrace the faith itself. Yes, on maybe a superficial level. And that's why it's good when these priests do this to kind of put themselves at least under some sort of guidance and authority. So it's good, for instance, that I have superiors. So whenever I try to do something stupid, they call me out for it, and I don't do those stupid things as often as I probably would otherwise.
Yeah.
And then in his retirement, what do you see a heroic priest like Father Normandin do? He retires to our nursing home and then serves as the chaplain in the nursing home while he's a resident there.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful example. And there are plenty of other priests who take stands like that, who don't go to the extremes of sedevacantum or the tuck line of craziness. It just remain faithful to the Mass, and they suffer for it, and they use that suffering and their powers to help sanctify souls. We need sacrifices like that from priests to recognize that, realize that, and stand up. And, if these bishops have no priests because these priests are demanding these things, the bishops are going to change too. And some of these priests might end up becoming those bishops at some point in time. Yeah. Not all priests, in order to do this, need to join us. The society is a lifeboat, but it's not the only one. And it's not the Bark of Peter. And they may not even need to join any traditional group, but maybe they can even work in their diocese or order. But whatever the situation, they have to remain principled. So the sacrifice is on the part of the faithful, but on the priest too. Unfortunately, I've known many priests who, even that I've helped to train to say the traditional Mass after Summorum Pontificum, they got comfortable. They were given free permission to do things. Their bishop didn't want to touch them. They got a new bishop, Traditionis Custodes hit, and now they go back to what they were doing before. They say maybe the traditional Mass privately when they can, because they're doing their best, but they're afraid to lose out. I want to give them that confidence if they hear these words here, that the faithful will support you as long as you're trying to help them to embrace the real faith and not other things aside from that, and you're focusing on the Mass. So we need those kinds of sacrifices, both on the part of priests and on the faithful, to have the traditional Mass and not accept the Novus Ordo. That's the antidote. That's the solution.
Yeah. There are, from more of a meta perspective, zooming out, how are we in the traditional movement? How is the SSPX meant to work with Rome about some of these things? I've heard these very hard line, and I think we saw that over the last 13, 14 years when the SSPX started having conversations with Rome about some of these doctrinal issues. There were some who really stood back and said, hey, we are not even going to start talking with Rome until you recant everything. And to me, that always seemed very principled and probably coming from a good place, but just not realistic. Am I a compromiser if I believe that?
I wouldn't say it's principled. I think it comes from a place of principle, and I think there are principles there. But I think there are oftentimes principles are good, but prudence puts those principles into practice, and that's where I think one of the things we have to remember too in dealing with these practical things, right? And this is where we can kind of draw these things together too. We have a liturgy problem, we have a doctrine problem, and it needs to be fixed from the top. And this is what we mean when we say Rome needs to convert, right? Rome needs to come around to its senses and fix the doctrine problem and fix the liturgy problem. We have to help to drive it that direction. We can be the force to motivate, or the impetus, but it has to be the leader. It has to be the hierarchy that changes these things in a good way. Mm-hmm. So we do need to cooperate. We are a church. We are a hierarchical church. Even if Rome has seemingly, in a certain sense, lost the faith, and put scare quotes around that, of course, it's because it's embraced something that is antithetical to the faith. But oftentimes, and I think this is just a little aside, my own opinion here, I think you see people like maybe even our present Pope, who is good-willed enough, but doesn't really see the problem.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have people like that. Maybe he's not. Maybe we'll find out that. Maybe, et cetera. But you will have plenty of goodwill people who just don't know, who just don't understand. And you need to talk to them. How are you ever going to bring them to the faith until you start to bring them towards the faith? Have a conversation. Yes, at the doctrinal level, etc. But we need to move that direction. So you often hear we can't compromise with Rome. Rome just needs to return tradition, convert. No, I don't think anybody really has an interest in compromise. I really don't. I think maybe even within the society, we have made prudential errors at times. Let's be honest about that. It does happen. We're fallible human beings.
Yeah.
We can make mistakes. And yet at the same point in time, I don't know anybody who I've ever talked to from the highest person in the society down to the lowest has any interest in compromising our principles. And when those people have outside of the society and joined some other group or made this decision or this deal or compromise or whatever, nobody's been happy with that, right? It's clear that there are plenty of people in the church who seem good-willed. They don't understand the problem is doctrine. And so there's going to be, for a long time, let's be honest about this, a crisis in the church, even if in the meantime we obtain some favor from Rome by being nice. I really think that Pope Francis was as kind to us as he was to help us with visas in Argentina and various other things, because we had relatively straightforward conversations with him when he was in Argentina.
Yeah.
And he knew who we were, and he knew that we weren't crazy, and he knew that we were just on the fringes in our own way, and he kind of liked that, our honesty, and was willing to help us with those things.
And another thing I think that he really liked was that we put our money where our mouth was. Like we were helping the poor. We were going to places that were not very fun. They were not about padding our resume or getting money or getting donations. Like we were going and helping the marginalized and doing real missionary work. And I think he respected that.
That's part of the Catholic tradition too.
Right.
Catholic social teaching, understood correctly, Leo the 13th, maybe not other Leos at this point in time, we'll see. But Leo the 13th, there is a Catholic social teaching. We have obligations and we have obligations to people around us. And part of that is care for everybody, especially the household of faith, as St. Paul says. So I don't think anybody is really interested in compromise, but what does compromise look like? No one can really define that. It's just what I don't like oftentimes.
Yeah.
Now, but at the same point in time, obviously we do see that there's a problem and we can't compromise with that problem. The Pope in a recent interview was asked about the traditional Mass, and he wasn't negative towards it. He said people had asked about it and he was going to explore it, and it's a complicated issue. But there was a kind of naivety there. The Pope said, well, there's no problem, though, with the Novus Ordo in Latin. One can say that whenever he wants to. I don't know that he knows about the Diocese of Charlotte, but that's not exactly true.
Yeah.
But even if it were, it seems to make this all about the idea of a language or certain elements of reverence, which maybe he has reintroduced into papal masses versus other things before. But it's not about any of those things. It's really fundamentally about a doctrine, the liturgy that flows from that doctrine as well. So we may need to collaborate on certain levels if we're going to help people to actually fix the problem. We're going to have to go to Rome, just like Archbishop Lefebvre always did when he was invited, right? And have a discussion and call them out on their problems and various other things. But we have to, in all those things, have a limiting principle. When does that return to tradition happen? I don't know that I have an answer to that question. I'll be honest about that. I don't know when we're at that point.
Right.
But if the Pope, now I said before, a Pope can't offer the traditional Mass, but okay. But let's say the Pope could, and tomorrow he begins offering the traditional Mass, as Pius XII or John the 23rd did. Is that Rome's conversion? Or do we need more? Is that sufficient? Or no? What if, as you asked early along, the Pope decreed that Novus Ordo Mass was no longer to be said, and we're going to translate the 1962 into vernacular, and that has to be used instead? Mm-hmm. Is that the solution? Is that where we end up? Is that a return to tradition? Would accepting that be a compromise? I don't know that we really have a good answer to that. I think that has to be fleshed out. But before we start declaring any moves that direction as compromise, we need to define our terms. And that's ultimately, I think, we need to come down to it is we do have to see moves, and we do have to see changes in certain people and certain things. Rome has to come back to tradition. both doctrinally and liturgically. How do we do that? I don't know that there's a good answer necessarily. I think it's something that only God's providence will show us what the real answer is. But I think it doesn't help when we just accuse everybody of compromising when they want to come to, realistic principles about liturgy.
Right.
So,
and it also doesn't help to be, lambasting others for finally discovering tradition. Oh, well, where were you years ago, months ago? You're here now. Welcome.
Sounds like somebody's complaining about being higher than the first hour, and the 11th hour guys are coming in and getting the same pay.
Yeah, kind of sounds like that, which is admittedly a hard gospel to hear, but we have to hear it.
It is. Because a lot of us were that 11th hour. I mean, I was not ordained at 24. I'll put it that way.
Right. Exactly right. So the
Yeah.
crisis is, in short, the crisis is going to continue. It's not over tomorrow. And like you said, Leo the 14th could start mandating the traditional mass tomorrow. There are still things to do.
There's whole dioceses to convert. Rome, yes, maybe we fix Rome, but it's the church has never been as perhaps a utopian whole as a lot of people think.
Right.
And the history of the church bears that out. It's going to take generations to fix the problem. Where we can start is understanding that, maybe why the traditional mass is a better question. Why this? And I think that maybe is a good we're coming to the end of the mass series here. Maybe you understand why the traditional mass. What is it? We've been talking about this whole time. Why is the Novus Ordo Mass such a problem? But we can't forget the crisis series. It was sort of one of the early things that we can't think that the mass is the solution without the crisis series and what we've talked about there. It's hand in glove. They have to go together. The crisis is not a liturgical war, and the crisis is the reason we exist. The society exists, right? It's not for liturgical wars that we exist,
right?
It's for this crisis. Archbishop Lefebvre would have founded the society even if the mass didn't change. The mass did change, and that was a great sign of that. But it was people who came to him before the mass changed, wanting to be educated, for instance, in traditional doctrine, because their seminaries were not traditional. That's why they came to him. Not, hey, you have the traditional mass. They could have found any priest to do that. Many priests were interested in doing that. It was Archbishop Lefebvre who gave them the solid doctrine. So the crisis
SSPX,
is one.
Yeah, the SSPX started before 1970.
Yeah.
There you go.
Our founding document is the 1st of November, 1970, but that was after various other things, right? So it's important to remember that the crisis is a doctrinal one primarily, liturgically secondarily. And the basis for which Archbishop Lefebvre felt compelled in 1988 to consecrate bishops, even against the will of the Pope, though, again, in principle, the Pope agreed to this, was a doctrinal problem. Was the lack of a response on the dubia that he sent in a doctrinal problem? Was the continued marginalization of traditional doctrine and catechesis and the problems in the church? It was a doctrinal problem. There was a liturgical element to it, yes. It was a doctrinal problem. And this doctrinal problem is going to be this reason that probably for the rest of my life, I'm traveling every weekend to say mass for, say, 600 people on the weekend like I do now. And other priests are going to continue doing that too. Yes, we're even going to go out and help other priests, right? So we're working for souls, we're working for priests. And that's why the society exists, not for the mass. The mass is an absolutely essential part. It's for the doctrine. It's really for the priests. And that's what we can help with this antidote. The antidote is partially also not just doctrine, but priests. And I don't know exactly when this is coming out and when we'll produce this, but I'm sure soon after or just soon before, the live stream of the Angelus press conference or recordings in various conferences will be coming out on precisely that, vocations.
Yep.
That's a real important part to this antidote is more priests. Where do we go from here? Really, what's the antidote aside from this doctrinal, rectitude that we need? Ultimately, what we pray at every rosary in the society chapels, priests, more holy priests, more holy religious vocations, and more holy Catholic families. Do that, demand the traditional mass, we will win. And it may take 100 years for that to happen. You and I might not see the end of it, but we may see an important part of the beginning to these solutions, this antidote being at least injected.
And to break it down even further, it's the church of the home. It's maintaining the faith with your kids at home. That's where vocations start.
Mm-hmm. It's also where your devotion to the Mass starts, right? Mm-hmm. If you make going to the church, going to devotions, a really important part of there, you talk about the Mass, you take lessons from it. It's not just, oh yeah, we have to show up on Sunday morning, but we're going to go to the football game afterward.
Yeah.
If we treat it like people treated it in the 1980s and the 1950s, we're not going to solve the problem. Right. We are a part of the problem.
Yep. Father, great interview, great conference. Thank you so much for putting this together for us. And
it's my pleasure.
Looking forward to, are you going to be part of the conversation next week? I think there's a round table, or we're kicking around the idea of maybe doing a round table of some sort about recommended reading.
I have not gotten an invite yet, but that doesn't mean it won't pop up in my inbox soon.
Yeah, we'll see. Either way, Father, thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to the next time we chat.
All right. God bless you. Thank you.
You too.